All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is our final abstract session of the conference. So first up, we have Mark talking about life expectancy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you, Mark.
Hi everyone. Thanks to the conference organisers for having me, and thank you all for coming along. I'll be talking today about the methodology that the ABS uses to estimate life expectancy for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Whadjuk Noongar Budja. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I will inevitably say we a lot in this talk, but I'm really talking about the methodology that was used to produce life expectancy estimates in 2016. So the ABS is scheduled to produce life estimates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people again, based on 2021 census data. That will be a future publication. So today I'm really talking about the work that was done long before I was employed at the Bureau of Statistics. So my goal today is just to provide an overview of the methodology and highlight some of the challenges that the ABS faces in actually producing these life estimates. So we'll start at the beginning. I'll just define that life expectancy at birth is the average number of years a person may be expected to live if the mortality rates at the time of birth are fixed over their lifetime. So it doesn't mean there's no motivation to predict anything. It's simply descriptive, and it's used as a key indicator of the overall health of a population. One of the primary reasons that the ABS produces these estimates is because they feed into the closing the gap strategy. The first target of which involves the elimination of the life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians within a generation. So that'll be by 2031, hopefully. I'd just like to say something about the Indigenous status variable, which appears in our data. It essentially, in any government survey or census or admin data, we ask people if they identify as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin. And of course, you can say you are not, or you can say you are Aboriginal, or separately you can say you are of Torres Strait Islander origin. Or if you are both, you can tick both yes boxes. So we encode this into an Indigenous status variable, which simply indicates whether or not a person has identified as being either Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And there's also a not stated category. So if you provide an answer that is ambiguous, or if you refuse to answer the question, then your data is still counted in the census, for example, but you will end up with a not stated Indigenous status. We aggregate the data in this way for statistical purposes, but I do want to acknowledge that there are hundreds of distinct cultural groups with their own history. So of course we lose information when we aggregate data, but it is for statistical purposes. So on the slide, I have the life expectancy estimates at birth that were published for the 2016 data. As you can see, there is a difference between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous estimates. I hope you'll forgive me the sin of not putting confidence intervals around these estimates. They are actually available online. I just forgot to put them in there. The life expectancy estimates are produced using something called life tables. And this is about the last time I'll talk about life expectancy, because in my mind, the key statistic that we actually estimate here is the mortality rate. And that's what goes into producing the life expectancy estimates. The mortality rate is simply, well, to calculate the mortality rate, you need to calculate or estimate the population at risk of dying at some point in time. And you need to somehow estimate the number of deaths that occur in a time period around that point in time. So it's a simple equation, but there are some problems from the get-go. So the two problems I want to highlight here are that the size of the population is produced by the ABS. So it's the estimated resident population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Their primary Indigenous status variable that goes into that estimate comes from the post-enumeration survey, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Whereas the death counts come from admin data provided by the offices of births, deaths and marriages in each state. And there's a conceptual difference between the Indigenous statuses that feed into the data. So there's a bias potentially between the numerator and the denominator. So the response from the ABS is to construct adjustment factors. So we modify the number of deaths that appear in the numerator using a process that I'm about to outline. So first of all, I mentioned the estimated resident population. I'll just quickly mention that the counts for the estimated resident population primarily come from the census. But of course, the census does not capture everyone. People might be overseas, people might not answer the form. So we provide coverage estimates of undercount for using a post-enumeration survey. So shortly after the census, we ask people, where were you on census night? Did you fill out the census, this type of thing? And one important fact about the post-enumeration survey is that there is no not stated Indigenous option. So it's interviewer assisted and we can actually always get an Indigenous status from the respondents. So here's the results for the 2016 estimated resident population. The key things I wanted to highlight here are that you can see the distribution of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. It varies a lot between states, and in particular, the four largest states, New South Wales, Queensland, WA, and the Northern Territory, are the only states which we were in 2016 able to provide accurate estimates for. So those are the only states that had state-specific life expectancies published for them. So the second ingredient is the deaths data, which I've mentioned comes from admin data. But the way the ABS goes about correcting this misidentification of Indigenous status in the death records is by data linking. So what I've got on the slide is a cross-classification. So the death registry data has been linked to census data. And this is aggregated across all age groups and the whole country. You can look at lower level classifications, but you can see there is a difference here. So there's 2,611 people who were reported as Indigenous in the census within the linked data, and 2,315 who were reported as Indigenous in the death registry within the linked data. I don't have time to dive into the details, but there is lots of information about the linkage quality available online if you're interested in looking. We can combine this cross-classification of census and death data with the cross-classification we get by linking the PES data with census data. So I mentioned that there is no need for a not status categorical variable in the PES, the post-enumeration survey. So what that means is we can calculate these, what they call concordance propensities, which means we can look at each census category in this cross-classification of the PES against the census, and look at the proportion of people within each census category that go on to identify as being Indigenous in the post-enumeration survey. So in my opinion, this is sort of the most important slide of the whole talk. It's where the real meat is contained. So we have these, sorry for being a bit crude. We have these concordance propensities. What we can do, or what we want to do, is adjust the death counts that are provided by the census status in the linked data. Okay, so we have the, I'm not going to scroll back. We have, so the death counts for each Indigenous status in the census data. We adjust the death counts. Effectively, we are in a way we are imputing using the census status, but we make an adjustment to the death counts by multiplying by these propensities. So, for instance, in this first case, we've got the number of people who are identified as Indigenous in the census and the PES multiplied by the proportion of people who actually identified as Indigenous in the census and then went on to identify as Indigenous in the PES. I think I misspoke when I mentioned the first thing here. I'm talking about the census deaths data set. It's a bit tricky working across multiple data sets. Okay, so we have this adjustment, or this estimate of deaths, and of course you can't go and feed that directly into your mortality rate because this is linked data. We've thrown away any records that we weren't actually able to link. So what we do is we construct an adjustment factor. We look at the ratio of the adjusted deaths to the that we've just calculated over the linked deaths that were recorded as Indigenous in the deaths registry. And we can use this to sort of estimate the under-identification of the Indigenous status in the death records. So we take that number, go and multiply it by the number of deaths we actually recorded in the death records prior to linking, and use that to calculate our mortality rates. There's a lot of room for improvement in this process. The ABS has a lot of pressure from our data users and from academics to feed additional information into these estimates. Now, I've been working at an Australia level in the talk. In reality, we're not actually working purely with completely pooled data. It's just a simplification, but in the slide here, I have a plot where you can see it's broken up by each of the census Indigenous statuses. The red lines are the Australia level estimates of the different propensities, and the black dots are the state-specific estimates for a selection of states or territories. Now, just eyeballing it, it looks like there might be a difference or some sort of state-specific effect. I wasn't able to put confidence intervals on these because the standard errors with these propensities are not actually published. But the raw data is available, and if you go and look at it, you can see some of these cells counts are very small. So for instance, if we look at the Queensland's data, the estimate of propensity to be identifying as Indigenous in PES, given a not stated status in the census, is based on an observation of 3 people who identified as Indigenous. Is that wrap it up, or a minute? Okay, so we quickly encounter the bias variance trade-off. We're being asked to do things with the data that are not entirely feasible if we just break the data up in the way that we've been doing in the past. So we'll skip over the stability. I'd just like to mention that we're exploring the possibility of estimating these propensities rather than simply taking a numerator and dividing it by a denominator. We'd like to build a multi-level model to try and see if we can pull information from multiple categories. So we still allow things like age and state to have an effect on the propensity estimates. But in the cases where there's very small cell sizes, we want to utilize some of that information from similar groupings. That's it from me. Thank you for your time. And I would, if you have any thoughts on this process, any suggestions, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Mark. That was very interesting to see what goes on behind the scenes of the census. Are there any questions?
Thanks for the interesting talk, Mark. You said at the beginning, life expectancy at birth is calculated based on the mortality rates. And I might have missed it, but how do you calculate the mortality rates of non-Indigenous? It says everybody in Australia, also people who immigrated here, because then their mortality rates would have an upwards bias.
So the life expectancy, it would be for the estimated resident population only. I don't think I understood the whole question. Would you highlight the key?
Well, I wanted to get into what is the mortality rate for non-Indigenous, because I immigrated to Australia at the age of 25. So if I'm counted at some point when I'm dying and they see, oh, this guy died at this age, I would create a bias in the mortality rates of non-Indigenous Australians, because I came here at a certain age and I survived so far. So it's very well known that countries that have a huge immigration have survival bias there in these mortality rates. So I wonder, especially then since the gap, closing the gap, wants to close that gap, it would only be fair to only compare the Indigenous population to people who are born in Australia and not just everybody. So that was my actual question, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, so like I said, we don't have anything that accounts for the changing population, and the population is changing. We encounter a similar problem in that actually the propensity to identify as Indigenous is changing over time, or so it's believed, and that does affect the mortality rates in what I assume is a similar way.
Any other questions? Great, can we all thank Mark again, please? Great. Now for our final abstract of the day, we have Andrea, who's going to be giving us a talk about gender imbalances in mathematics and statistics. So this one is down as a 5-minute presentation, but we're still going to allow some question time at the end. So think up some great questions for her.
Hi everyone, so my name is Andrea Cavallo, and today, as said before, I am going to be talking about gender imbalances present in the stats community. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on today, which here in Perth is the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So a bit about me. I'm currently working at the Australian Bureau of Statistics as a statistical methodologist for business surveys. Prior to this, I studied a Bachelor of Science majoring in mathematics and statistics and economics at the University of Western Australia. I did the bare minimum 3 years, and I don't know how all you postdoctorates do it. So in my part-time, I also volunteer on the global team for an organisation called RoboGals that encourages female and gender diverse school students to pursue STEM careers. Before I commence, I would like to state that although I work at the ABS and volunteer at RoboGals, the views I share with you are completely personal and may differ from the views of the organisations. I would also like to acknowledge that as a cisgender woman, my experience is different to trans women. I acknowledge that gender is a social construct and is not a binary ideology. In my discussion, the term woman and man is used to describe individuals who identify as such. Cool. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a personal story today. So imposter syndrome, most of us know what it is. Most of us probably have felt it. It's quite common among very analytical and technical individuals. So imposter syndrome is a term first coined by psychologists Susanna Imes and Pauline Rose Clance in the 1970s. It defines the internal experience of believing that you are not as competent as you are, as others may perceive you. And it persists a continued feeling of inadequacy that persists despite success. For me personally, it reinforces a feeling of inferiority and perpetuates the rhetoric that I don't deserve to be here, but everyone else around me does. So I would say that my experience of this phenomenon was a little bit different to the majority of people. During my tertiary education and career, my imposter syndrome didn't remind me that I don't deserve to be here, but everyone else does. It was instead just like, I don't deserve to be here, but he does. He being the majority of my cohort, the people I was competing against and trying to prove my value to, a room of majority men. This has always fostered a feeling of inadequacy, especially during my tertiary studies. A feeling that I'm not smart enough to be a mathematical statistician. However, the cohort of men around me were. I built a narrative on my head that my male colleagues were more intelligent than me. And I was trying to seek approval that I was not just a diversity hire or a personality hire. And my contribution to the statistical field has impact. So there's something that always bothered me also about stereotypes. There's no denying that stereotypes exist and that there's this unconscious bias that women are fit for careers that are more caring and expressive, whilst men are suited for more technical roles. This contributes to stereotype that maths is like a male-dominated, nerdy subject. We see this in a lot of media we consume. So like when I was growing up, we had Angelina Ballerina for the girls and Jimmy Neutron for the boys, or we had the Babysitters Club versus Phineas and Ferb. The thing is, the majority of people don't consciously believe it. Most of us don't believe that women are not as intellectual or analytical. However, for some reason, it always still impacted my career and my capacity within STEM. So I found that there's a phenomenon called stereotype threat. It states that stereotype groups are significantly concerned about their performance on evaluative tasks and not to be judged according to the negative stereotype that already exists, and hence not further perpetuating their perceived inferiority in this domain. So for instance, being statistically incorrect or coming across as having poor analytical skills in front of a client I just met at work, where they were being critical of my performance. I feared falling into the stereotypical perspective they may have on my ability. So that's my personal story and a little bit about what I experienced during my career and during my education. We all have our stories to tell. These narrative and situations stem, unintended, from the lack of representation or from a product from the lack of representation. Data shows that in Australia, women only make up 28% of workers in science, technology, engineering, and maths. And my personal experience has shown years of exclusively male teachers and line management. This brings up an interesting discussion, a discussion on affirmative action. Affirmative action is used to reconcile disparity between gender in statistical spaces in this context. It is positive steps taken to increase the representation of women and other minority groups, and in this context, specifically maths and stats. So, for instance, earlier this year, the Australian government announced $6.7 million in additional funding to expand initiatives to address the gender gap in STEM for students. We also see workplaces adopt quotas to ensure gender diversity in technical areas or hiring processes. And in fact, in the ABS, we have a 50-50 split of men and women in senior executive levels. These actions counteract the subconscious bias that society has ingrained in us. It counteracts stereotype threat, feelings of inferiority to male colleagues. Keep going. As I have previously touched on, and balance the impacts of not having enough female role models. or interview bias. But later on, I'm very interested to hear everyone's thoughts. Before closing off and entering into discussion, I did want to bring up the topic of intersectionality. I think it's very important to view any feminist ideologies from an intersectional perspective. Women who identify as LGBT+, disabled women, women of colour, women from low socioeconomic positions, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are even more impacted by discrimination, stereotypes, and unconscious bias. This is not my lived experience, so I can't talk about it, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are less likely to express interest in STEM-related careers, and the gap hasn't changed for the last 20 years. It is important that all women are given the assistance and support to create diversity in statistical spaces. So I think it'll be really interesting to open up the floor for discussion and would love to hear what other people say. There is a term coined by the second wave feminist, Carol Hainish, which says the personal is political, that our personal stories, they are shaped by our environment and our social and political environment. And I think that it's really important to be open about our experiences so that other people around us can hear and understand. But thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Thank you for that, Andrea. Definitely relate with a lot of what you said there. Open it up to the floor.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I just wondering if you have any thoughts. Working at a children's hospital, my workplace is actually really female dominated because it's quite common for women to choose to work in the children's health space. And there's a lot of opportunities for nurses and research assistants to have children, and they're really supported there. But what I find is, despite having lots of really powerful, well-educated women around me, in the home, they're still really in a patriarchal environment. They're almost always the primary caregiver for their child. They're expected to leave work if their child is sick while their male partners stay at work. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can continue to help support women who are mothers, particularly to stay in the workplace and to continue to be elevated, despite the fact that they might also be the primary caregivers for their children.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not an expert in this. I do not have children myself, but I definitely think that is something we need to consider. I think when we, at the end of the day, we do kind of live in a society where women are the caregivers. They are the sole responsible. Data shows that they do most of the housework and unpaid leave. And situations like that also do lead to the wage gap that exists in society. I think it is a slow progression, and it requires, I guess, change from family compositions in the way work is divided within a family. And that's not something you can do. You can't do that through implementing like quotas or anything. There's no affirmative action for that. But I think that it's something when we teach younger generations on issues such as gender inequality and issues such as how unpaid leave, unpaid work and, you know, being a caregiver is not a woman's job. I think it will come through generational change. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. That was really interesting and really important things. And thank you for sharing a lot of those personal experiences as well. My question comes from, I guess, as someone who identifies as male, when we find ourselves in these situations where, you know, within a maths cohort, we do identify as kind of, you see a lot more men in a particular classroom, for example. What kinds of affirmative actions, steps would you see, or would you like to see from men that would be supportive in the gender equality kind of drive? What can men do better, in essence?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Gia. I do want to kind of emphasize and say, first of all, it is not a personal attack on any particular man. I'm just saying it's more of like a social issue. So ideally, definitely, we can all make individual change, and that's where it stems from. But at the end of the day, it is no matter what, like it doesn't take just a single person's actions to change. It is there is still unconscious bias prevalent. So it is not the sole responsibility of a single individual. However, I feel like, first of all, acknowledging that you do have unconscious bias prevalent due to the way you've been brought up and due to your social factors. I think that's really important. I think it's also really important to be aware that to be inclusive, because sometimes I've been in situations where I'm one of few females, and sometimes I'm a bit, feel a bit intimidated by all the men. So I think that's also something to think about, especially in, I guess, going through a tertiary education where it is a bit more casual and less, I guess, like a work environment and professional environment. But I think just more being conscious of the fact that this may be an issue for other people.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions. Sorry, my ring got stuck. We're gonna wrap up now. Can we all thank Andrea again? So people in person, you can continue this conversation over lunch or questions in the Slack. I'll hand over